My name is Paula Borowska, and I'm a PhD student here at CIS. For my PhD, I studied Belarusian Protestants, and I try to understand whether they can promote or inhibit social change in the country. But today, I would like to speak about, tell you more about the article that I'm working on recently, and it's about traditional forms of social capital in Belarus, Talaka or Subbotnik. Since this is my work in progress, I will be very thankful for your comments and your feedback. So, this one. Okay, sorry. I study the Belarusian civil society through social capital, and Kurapaty, what I call Kurapaty 2017, has become my case study, and I will discuss it in a minute, soon. So social capital has become a buzzword in social sciences, but it can actually be boiled down to three main things. So relationships, norms of reciprocity and trust, and values. Some scholars say that they quote social capital with civil society, but these two concepts are not the same at all. While civil society comprises those organizations, voluntary organizations, associations of people who can act for the common good and are independent from the state, social capital is more like a facilitator of a collective action. When it comes to the region, the post-Soviet region, some scholars say that social capital there is anti-communitarian, is negative. So they basically, what they're trying to say is that it is more about clientelism, than rather being orientated towards the common good. I was actually thinking whether this is really the case of Belarus, because of course another question is how to measure it. Well, some people do what Robert Putnam has done, so they just count NGOs, and then yes, if we import the same strategy to this region, we actually will sort of understand that social capital is definitely, there are lost stocks of social capital. But I was thinking this is just part of the story, and we need to look for something else. And what I argue in my paper is that we need to actually look for local, traditional forms of social capital. And here, sorry again. So here I sort of thought that Talaka versus Subbotnik might be an answer to this. Talaka was widespread in the second half of the 19th and the beginning of the 20th century. It was mutual assistance of nearby and distant neighbors during heavy agrarian works or urgent situations. For example, if someone's house burned down, people from the village, from the same village, maybe from the local, from some nearby villages, would come to help to rebuild it. It was voluntary, however, there was social pressure in force. So, of course, you had the right not to take part, not to help, for example, with harvesting. But there was this mechanisms of social pressure, which probably would lead to your exclusion in the community. So, of course, people would naturally take part in it. Talaka was spontaneous, and it's interesting actually because there are not that many materials on Talaka. But at some point, like when I read, it just seems that it just disappeared. So my understanding is that just urbanization wiped it out. At least in this meaning, which we had when we think about the second half of the 19th and beginning of the 20th century. And then we've got Subbotnik, which first appeared in the times of the Russian Civil War in 1919, and then it was restored by Alexander Lukashenko in 1997. Today, I think it's more like a political ritual in Belarus. Many politicians, leading politicians, including Alexander Lukashenko, they take part in Subbotnik. Well, it's interesting that actually Subbotnik is supposed to be voluntary, yet it is coercive in practice. And there is some research showing that actually people who don't take part in it, they have to they face some informal sanctions. For example, their employers wouldn't pay them some bonuses at the end of the month. And just two pictures showing here Subbotnik in Orsha 2018. So people planting flowers in I think in a park, and here we've got the first one. And it moved me really because I can see this boy who probably I'm not sure whether that was his kind of dream Saturday, but probably because one of his parents was forced to go, he just had to join them. But let's focus more on Talaka. So Talaka played a couple of functions in a rural community. But before just discussing these functions, we need to understand what was the role of a community, of a village back in those days. So a village was a sort of a central arena for socialization and learning certain norms, ways of behaving. So there we've got the functions. For the first one, the way of communication. People, let's say, imagine that people meet for they help their neighbors with harvesting. They work, but while working, actually, they joke, they laugh, they discuss certain things. So it helps release social pressure, but also maintain social stability in a community. They also socialize. They learn how to behave in the community, but also they learn very basic work skills. There was also an economic function because just people needed more hands to work, to help with work. And can you think of any other, better place to find your future wife or a husband than actually Talaka? People had a chance actually to see their future wives. Ideally hardworking women, so they see whether they could make a good wife. So another quite interesting function. But now. A modern case study of Talaka, which I sort of identify Kurapati 17 as a case study, as a case of example of it. Kurapati is the forest in the outskirts of Minsk, and in 1987, Zenon Pazniak, with his colleague, they discovered mass graves of victims of Stalin's Great Terror. Of 1937-1941. And this discovery back in 1987 led to mass demonstrations in Minsk. Then we had also a series of protests in 2001. In 2004, this memorial site in Kurapati with these mass graves was recognized as sort of officially was recognized as was actually put on the register, state register. However, there was still some conflicts over the place between the authorities and between civil society groups. And in 2013, as far the Minsk authorities, I think they sort of decided to expand the belt ring, the ring road in Minsk, and then 2014, actually this plot of land was near this memorial site was put on auction and sold it for future constructions in there. And actually in 2017. There was a restaurant, so 50 meters from these mass graves, from this memorial site, there was a new restaurant was just built, and this actually led to many protests, and many various different social activists got engaged. The Young Front, Belarusian Christian Democratic Party, but also I would say, as far as I read what was available in media, many simple, ordinary Belarusians who aren't very much into politics, but they just felt that this is something that they associated with. And which needs to be protected. So they organize marches, protests. They also, especially I think the Young Front, they are picketing the newly opened restaurant, hoping that actually that would discourage guests from coming there, and actually the owner would have to at some point just close it down. And they also erect crosses there. So this is sort of thing which I think this. Can be seen as a modern case of Talaka, and plays certain functions too. Thank you very much for your attention, and hope to hear your comments. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you, Paula. This was even briefer than we expected, but it's always good to have more time for questions as well. All right, then we are proceeding to the last presentation for this panel on social movements, which is by David Kurkowski from University of Warsaw in Poland.
So, I don't know what year-long fellowship, not exactly from the University of Warsaw as such, but...
Okay, and the title of your presentation is The Experience of the First World War and the Belarusian National Movement, a Vilnius case study.
I missed it.
So, upon we got his presentation, which is...
No, it's not called any of these things. It's called quotes dash 29 is how it begins.
Where we can find it?
It's on the desktop because I have not emailed it, so it's not possible that we're
Can we go on desktop?
Quotes dash...
Here, okay, in the right corner, yeah.
Okay, so...
Yeah, please, 15 minutes as well.
I'll try my best to be brief. The problem is when I try to be brief, I read things very quickly. So if there's any point where I'm speaking too quickly and someone's not understanding, because most people in the United States also don't really understand me either, I just ask you to raise your hand or let me know or holler. Also, it'll be a little bit interesting because it seems like we'll have a panel, someone will be talking a little bit later, at least what the program tells me, about World War I and about sort of, let's say, Belarus 100 years ago. And though this conference, as far as I understand, is more geared toward, let's say, what's going on right now, more geared toward, let's say, a policy kind of aspect, what I want to kind of say is that all these things that I will be talking about, and hopefully this will become clear, and hopefully some of you will share in the opinions or have some criticisms, and we can actually engage in a debate. When we, for example, in Warsaw had on Saturday, the Dzień Woli, the Day of Freedom celebration, and on Monday, everyone, of course, has to write, because what else are you going to do other than write a post and say Belarus with for multiple people, and let's have a certain kind of Belarusian nationalism. And as always, something that, I'm sorry, I don't know how to say this in English, Facebook srać, Facebook, just kind of everyone arguing and yelling at each other, begins. And hopefully this will give a little bit of context for those of us that, let's say, adhere to, let's say, a more leftist approach, that adhere to studying Belarus not just as a Belarusian state or a state with sort of, or a movement, a national movement, social movement that's centered around the Belarusian language, but also one, and this is actually what our presentation that we had 2 presentations ago that Anna read about, for example, the fact that, yes, until 1938 we had 4 languages, Yiddish and Polish and Russian in addition to Belarusian. And this is something that we should not forget, and something that's very interesting because it definitely is something, it's definitely very important to study historically, but it also gives us a lot of raw material for talking about political movements and social formations today. And one last comment I want to make before I begin, and if it's okay, I'm going to be more or less reading so that I stay on track. One small comment is we have, can we just go to the first slide? Is that okay?
You can use...
I'm not going to... sorry, I forgot about that.
So just press here.
Just press down. Okay, so I apologize ahead of time. I'm not going to actually be talking about these quotes. I'm just going to leave them on. I apologize, I was a bad boy. I did not translate them. I did not translate them into Latin Belarusian, for those of you that, let's say, read Polish and more or less understand Belarusian through that. So I hope some of you can read Belarusian. We have a little bit of Latin afterwards, so maybe that makes more of you able to read it. Later in the comments, and if you're interested, I can actually provide you some of these things I do have translations for, in the interest of time. So I'll kind of leave this as a backdrop for the things I'm talking about, so that if you get a little bit bored of what I'm saying, you can just read some nice literature or quotes, or some very problematic and scary polemics. Anyway, so I'll begin. So I want to give you guys a short background, because the title of this talk is The Experience of World War I and the Belarusian National Movement, what sort of gains and what sort of failures happened there. And that's the kind of project, it's this kind of general project that I'm working on right now as part of this fellowship at the Center of Eastern European Studies at Warsaw University, the University of And I'm actually not just focusing, mostly I will be talking about using as an example, as my case studies, various newspapers that were written in various languages that were permitted by the German occupation as of 1916, when they got rid of the Russian press, but they, had their own press. They allowed Belarusian language, Polish language, Yiddish language, and Lithuanian languages presses to function. And mostly, in Lithuanian case, I guess it changes a couple of times. But we have, for example, the Dziennik Wileński. We have Let's last news or most recent news in Yiddish. We have a couple of Lithuanian ones and the Belarusian one, certainly not as famous and not as important to our field as Dasha Niva, but at the very least important enough such that it is often cited, and all of these comments about 101 year anniversary. There's even a whole Kontakte page where they post and give you like day-by-day tidbits of what was happening 100 years ago in Vilna. So, obviously attracts some attention. And so I'm not going to talk too much about the background. What I will say, I just want to give a few points without really talking about, let's say, because it is important to talk about the fact that certain things that were allowed for Belarusians were not necessarily in this period, and we're talking about 1915, 16, 17, 18, up until the end of the year, when we'll have a whole bunch of conflict and fighting and uncertainty about who Vilna will go to. A lot of the things that were attained, or let's say happened for the first time, were not necessarily attained as directly as such by, let's say, Belarusians. A lot of times it was part of, let's say, a German national policy, part of their kind of attempt to divide and conquer, to sort of colonize the Slavs in a certain way, the Ober-Ost sort of region. And in a way, we actually see in some of the ways in which the Slavs were treated and researched and colonized or occupied by the Germans for those years, in a way, and some scholars have actually said this, and we can talk about it, but I won't talk about it now. We can see this perhaps as almost a template, or as sort of a starting point for things that are going to happen, things that do end up happening, ways in which the Germans treat the Slavs and the Jews and everyone, and sort of the colonization of Europe as such in World War II. So, the point is, World War I is not necessarily boring or not worth our time, because it is this kind of very much a watershed moment. And just a few brief points about things that, let's say, in these few years, again, with that giant asterisk of, let's not say that, like, thank you Germans for invading us and making it possible for a Belarusian language class in Vilna to be there. I'm not saying that we should, like, praise the Germans for that. But here's a couple of points, in my opinion, things that sort of happened in this period. So one, material culture, including several Belarusian language newspapers or leaflets. Some of them, like Holman, lasted for a very long time. Some of them for shorter periods of time, or perhaps were just one-off published. I'll talk about one such monthly that was only published one time ever in 1918 in the city. Secondly, we have, as part of the perhaps anti-Russian, perhaps also anti-Polish as such, and let's not forget that duality, policy of the Germans throughout this period. We have school classes that, as far as I understand, as part of from some kind of clubs, but really, like, for the first time, we have schooling in Belarusian. And are Belarusians ready to teach their children in Belarusian? Perhaps not, and that's a whole other issue that we're not going to go into. Dictionaries, ones in which basically for the purpose of lots of complicated terms in German. Obviously, languages like Belarusian, Lithuanian, Latvian, Yiddish aren't able to handle it, but we have these German to Belarusian. I think there's 6 or 7 of these dictionaries that are actually published by 1918. And in the case of Belarusian and Yiddish, it's very interesting because, as you can imagine, there's probably not that many dictionaries or textbooks for those languages, let alone standardized grammar rules. I mean, if for Belarusian and Yiddish, I would say that even now we don't really have real standardized grammar rules, or it's very much it's very much flexible, it's variational, it can all really depend on how you feel on a certain day, with Yiddish and Belarusian in particular, much more so than, let's say, Lithuanian, which is an interesting point, which is why I try to talk a lot about Yiddish and Belarusian together, because I think they should be compared, and they have a very similar, let's say, a social, let's say a national, let's say a post-colonial history that unites these two languages and the experiences of the people actually speaking them. And also grammars, for the first time, that are advertised in these newspapers, theaters that were sort of created or funded by and actually attended by Germans who perhaps had no idea what was going on. Anyhow, so this is a kind of small background, and I'm going to try to be a little bit quicker with actually reading this. Okay, so Belarusians and their neighbors. Like many Belarusian sources from the early 20th century, the golden age of so-called, let's put it, Belarusian nationalism, in the 20th century, talking back to early history, and national revivalism, rarely do we see social or national agitation occur in vacuum. In fact, the Belarusian language Vilna press often refers to cultural production, including print materials and narratives that were, and still, I would say, are, quite external to the Belarusian national movement and its immediate goals, to Belarusian national revivalism, to the language as such. And by this I mean references to other people and other languages and other presses, particularly hearkening to Jews, Lithuanians, and Poles, but also including a lot of conversations, if we're talking about the press, about what's going on in Ukraine, with the Centralna Rada, what's going on in the Baltic region, even Estonia, sometimes, usually not, but sometimes it is actually mentioned, etc., etc. And of course, things going on in Poland and Russia as the giant bulwarks that were, I have not pronounced that word in a while, they were afraid of. Hearkening to these groups with which the Belarusians would live in a shared Lithuania, which is kind of referred to in this kind of movement as krai, which let's just say is basically country or land, for lack of a better word, and with whom Vilna Belarusians, at the very least the ones in Vilna, have already been living in coexistence for centuries. A good example, the one that, and I'll change the slide here, the one that takes us slightly outside the immediate the immediate purview of Holman and this presentation, though already have gone outside the purview quite a while, can be found in a 1918 published one-off newspaper, Kryvichanin, edited by Václav Lastovsky. This was published in October 1918, and we have a quote here. The article Nazowa Białorusię po-żydowsku. That's really hard to translate because only really in Polish, and the Polish speakers here will understand what język żydowski actually means, because technically it's Jewish language, but realistically or practically it means Yiddish in this case. The name of Belarus in Yiddish/Jewish. This article is still inconspicuously tucked away at the bottom right corner of the 29th of 32 pages of this never-to-be-repeated so-called Belarusian Political Literary Monthly, and tells us a lot more about cultural contact and exchanges between neighbors that might seem to us originally, or that we might even expect coming from a contemporary perspective. The article introduces to a Belarusian speaking and reading, obviously, audience, because literacy is something to talk about as well in this period, almost as if uncovering a quaint little tidbit. The fact that the Yiddish word Reisen, one of several words that Yiddish offers to describe the region, a certain subset of the area where the Jews of historical Lithuania, or the Grand Duchy, lived and still live at that current time, contemporary to this quote. The article notes, for instance, that even parts of greater Białystok and Chernihiv region, Białystok, Chernihiv region fall under the imagined contours of this mysterious Reisen that's so quaint that it actually is referred to. And without losing ourselves in the details, and as I say, the devil is in them, I kind of wanted to really briefly, and this is not a conclusion because there's still a little bit more, but I want to kind of give two propositions or two, let's say, musings about what such moments tell us. These moments of these kinds of references, the fact that the Belarusian press that probably has other things to worry about other than what Jews, do they call it Lita or do they call it Reisen, etc., etc. For starters, we see that the myth of an exclusively Belarusian-centric Belarus, even at a time of rising interethnic tensions, especially at this time, especially in 1918 with the end of the war looming and a lot of uncertainty coming way, an irresistible, let's say, romantic nationalisms is actually quite a false one. The Jews of the region, like the Belarusians, played around with multiple versions of belonging, so Jews would perhaps have words like Lita, Lithuania, Greater Lithuania, as we all understand, Rysin, Weißrussland, which for example, like liberal, very much pro-Belarusian friend Veronika always says not Weißrusslandische, but Belarusische in Yiddish, very important, in their historical memories and geographical imaginations. Few visions of a future state where Belarusians would at last be free of imperializing Russians and enslaving Pańszczyzna, or Pańszczyna, or Polish lordship, in addition to creeping Bolshevism, could claim the exclusive dominance and presence of Belarusians. That is, even the Belarusians that were quite pro-Belarus understood that their future state would probably not only contain Belarus, just like other sort of narratives. Lots of inter-ethnic and kind of multicultural contexts, do form in the aftermath of World War I. A second point that I wanted to make, talking about this quote in particular, is that from the point of view of cultural materialism and cultural politics, shall we say, we observe here a concrete intertextuality, an interlingual, intercultural, interethnic conversation that is obscured today by the limitations of our own personal back histories that do not allow for such context. Because in Belarus, if people even speak Belarusian, they're certainly not, the average person is not speaking Yiddish and Polish, and most people don't know about, let's say, this kind of like interlinguistic, interethnic culture as such, because the main narratives that are purported and are proposed are the main narrative of a kind of like BSS, Belarusian Soviet Socialist, BSSR, Belarusian Soviet Socialist Republic, and this kind of like the statehood that's achieved through Soviet history and Belarusian civilization and things like that, or the alternative Belarusian and only Belarusian nationalistic, don't want to offend anyone, but it's going to happen anyway, so whatever, narrative in where we only have Belarusians because this was the language, and actually Lithuania was way more Belarusian because they didn't even have the language of the Tretий Statut, of the third article of Lithuanian law, and the chancellor language was Old Ruthenian, but actually it's Proto-Belarusian, and the fact that these two narratives are the only ones that are existent make it very difficult to imagine anything. When historians do work, it makes it hard for them to see it, when it's quite evident. Furthermore, it makes it very hard for contemporary activists and historians and movers and shakers, let's call it that, to actually propose something different. Belarusians not only were well enough equipped at this time to be in contact, and by this I mean, quote, criticize, seek partnership, everything including and in between, their Lithuanian, Polish, and Russian compatriots, which, that's not that hard to imagine, especially with the Poles and Russians, because, most of them understood, or at the very least perhaps were able to read these languages, some, but so too their Yiddish-speaking neighbors of yore. As far as Vilna is concerned, close reading of Holman shows that this was very much the case throughout World War I. For example, throughout the history of the newspaper, we see very often, or at least often enough that I would say they certainly were aware of it and were reading it every day, citations of Dziennik Wileński, Lietuvos Aidas, no Lithuanian pronunciation here, I apologize, Letstanajas, etc., because whether it was for positive or negative reasons, they were commenting. And these paradigms of cultural exchange and shared, contested memories actually quite actively play out on the pages of Holman itself.
May I ask you to conclude?
To
conclude.
Okay, I'll go really quickly. Okay, so I guess the point I wanted to talk a little bit about Holman, and I apologize, it seems like I might have to ask you guys to ask me if you want the text of the presentation, because I won't be able to read the whole thing. But the point is, we actually do have a lot of this intertextuality that I'm also coming a little bit from a literary background, from a Slavicist background, philological background, even though in America philology as such really basically doesn't exist. That's not important. The point is that I'm kind of paying attention to a lot of these sort of like intertextual moments. So for example, we have a lot of references to what Americans are writing about, let's say, the ability to imagine a Belarus together with Lithuania. And sometimes we have this quote about Latvia even being included, that such a union with Latvia and Lithuania would be useful for Belarusians and Lithuanians, as well as for the Latvians, for a country structured in such a way which should be strong and powerful, able to cultivate its natural and successfully defend itself from foes. Very often we see references to the Polish press and also to the Russian press, because the way, especially at the end of 1918, when there's a little bit less of censorship from the German side and a lot more worries about what's going to happen, these kind of potential, what I call poputchiki or spodorozhniki, let's call them fellow travelers to the Belarusians, Poles, sometimes Jews, sometimes Lithuanians, almost always, they're referred to in different ways. So, for example, as far as Poles are concerned, and this is an example, there was this problem that there was a new bishop and he read a speech in all the languages, but he didn't read it in Belarusian, and apparently the Polish press, as you can read here, wrote something this thing called dziakowanie. They kind of spat on and disregarded the Belarusian language, said, well, of course he didn't read it. And we see this narrative of kind of basically being in between Moscow and Poland, Moskowszczyna and Pańszczyna, Moskiewszczyzna, Pańszczyzna, as I like to say in Polish. And what's interesting for me, and I really want to show you guys this last quote, because it's really interesting that we don't actually have so many references to the Jewish press. I imagine that it was relatively more hard, especially given the fact that we only have a Hebrew alphabet. So there's a certain learning curve that's involved, for myself and everyone else included, in reading Yiddish. At the same time, and there are a few, especially when the characters, for example, the Zionists become more powerful, or the Bundists become more powerful, and they obviously talk about this. But what's interesting is what's used as a relatively unique and and I'm still very interested in your comments because I'm writing about this currently, this kind of anti-Polish ploy using Żydowski pogromy, Jewish pogroms, as a kind of narrative. So, for example, you read this text where basically in the 3rd of December, you have, in 1918, you have a description of, and we all know a little bit, I think, about World War I history. We know there were a lot of pogroms in the wake, and there were crimes that were conducted by the Polish legions, building a new independent Poland, as well as other groups. But you have this basically description, read the very bottom, where you have «Уся жидовська часть Львова фактично перестала існувати». Well, so the entirety of the Jewish part of Lviv, basically stopped to exist. Which, if we that seems a little bit. I don't think that actually happened. Otherwise, in a very vibrant interwar Jewish history, probably wouldn't have been there. But a month earlier, which I find very interesting, when there were talks about rumors of pogroms that were being carried out against Jews in Vilna, so definitely something that might possibly accuse Belarusians of being, at the very least, innocent, non-innocent bystanders. And they say that Der Moment, a Warsaw-based Yiddish language newspaper, it's talking about all these pogroms in Vilna, but it's actually mystification, because never had this happened. Which is interesting, because then a month later, a certain form of mystification, but important, obviously they're talking about an important event, but at the same time, we kind of see them kind of performing this sort of, let's say, editorial mistake that they accused their Yiddish-speaking Warsavian colleagues of a month earlier.
Okay, last point.
And in lieu of conclusions, last point, because at this point I actually am really close, I'll just read these very short bullets in lieu of conclusions. Actually, they're just conclusions. Post-colonial, what I guess I want you guys to take away, and why I think, at least in the 101st year of Belarusian statehood as such, what does that mean, and what can we learn from these kinds of histories, World War I, and not only, and these intertextual exchanges? 1. Post-colonial and colonial concepts should be studied as such. We should treat them with the complexity they deserve. 2. The myth of one language, independent nationalisms that did not interact with one another, exclusive tautologies of belonging, is quite a false one. What a very famous Berkeley scholar, and I'm forgetting his name, calls back histories. We assume just because things are right now the way they are now, they were always that way, which is not true. It's a mistake. It's quite ahistorical and quite anachronistic. 3. Cultural and literary exchange took place in the same places where national exchange did. So even though we have these movements talking, we also have them writing about each other and sending letters to each other and probably reading each other. And last point, often a cultural politics took place. Okay, I'll skip this. And then last, studies of Belarusian nationalism, history of its national and cultural achievements and failures, gives us quite unique opportunities for post-colonial transnational studies of social movements and relations, in life and in text alike. Thank you so much for your attention. I apologize for the time. I hope this was interesting. And please contact me if you have any questions, comments, anything else. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Okay, great. Then then perhaps now it's time for questions, and the questions could be directed to a specific presenter, as well as, I believe, could touch upon very general issues related to social movements in Belarus and beyond it. So please.
Yes, I found all your talks very interesting, but the one thing I thought was lacking, and that was he discusses if all these societies were fairly socially homogenous. And I mean, one thing that was very much characteristic of Belarus and Ukraine and parts of eastern Poland was at this time, if you had the old nobility, and there was the extreme distinction between the old nobility, the upper nobility, the lower nobilities, who tended to have the land, and those factions which identified with Russia, and those factions which identified against Russia or with Austro-Hungary or with Germany, and also the role of Jews and Germans of middle classes in towns. And I think when you talk, particularly in the first two talks, talking about these late 19th century social occasions, it seems to me they applied exclusively to the peasantry. And one has to only remember the peasantry was only freed from serfdom a few decades before, so it gives a slightly false balance of the settled society. And also, if you look in the early 19th century, alone with the Polish language, it was deemed that the Polish language was actually only spoken by the Polish nobility, and not by the wider population who spoke German or Slavonic or other. And I think it's important to bring that into this picture.
Was it a specific question or just a comment?
Well, it was a question would be if you could perhaps expound on those aspects, on how perhaps it was a much more heterogeneous society with different social levels who played an equally great role.
All right. So, who wants to respond? Maybe.
I did not want to talk about so long past because it was not time, and it's a long history of Great Lithuanian Commonwealth with language, because it was in early medieval times and Renaissance times, and Great Duchy of Lithuania was an old Belarusian language, state language, and in the end of the 17th century, Polish language became also a national language, and of course it was spoken by nobility, by better educated or richer level of society, and peasantry was speaking local language, Belarusian language, and it was another topic, but because of peasantry have been speaking Belarusian, it gave possibility in 19th century for a revival of Belarusian language and revival of Belarusian movement, but it was another story. I wanted to focus on this.
Paula, you want to add something?
Yes, thank you for your comment. Yes, actually, definitely I should make that more clear that Talaka was just among peasants. The Talaka was a peasant thing, definitely. So I should definitely reflect on the sort of historical context in my paper too.
Thank you. David, any comment?
I don't have comment for this one, but that's okay.
All right, no problem. All right, any more questions, comments? Yeah, please.
Well, I got a question to Anna. Thanks for all your talks. Actually, two questions, in fact. Can we come back to the first slide of Anna's presentation? Is it possible?
Which one?
The one with the map of Polish distribution in Belarus. Yeah. I recently had a discussion on the internet with my colleagues, and let's say, have a look at the map of Belarus and map of Lithuania. You can see that all Poles live along the Belarusian-Lithuanian border, in fact. In some of the district states, like 80% of the population, and the situation is similar from the other Lithuanian part of the border. How's that? Is there an explanation why Polish people live along this border, but not, let's say, more southern areas, more northern areas, but have this? This doesn't look naturally such distribution of population.
before the Second World War, it was a part of Polish Second Republic. And
As well as the whole other
yes, because
Brest region.
Belarusian in 1921, after the Riga Treaty, Belarus was divided between Poland and Soviet Union. The Belarusians claim.
Yeah, but if you have a look at the map of the population distribution, let's say from the times of the First World War, the situation is similar. There were no resettlements or anything. They've been living here since 19th century at least, probably longer, along the current Belarusian-Lithuanian border, and there is no logical explanation for that phenomenon. I don't know.
I think that,
So there is still no.
It was probably closer to the main Polish land, so maybe this is can be one of explanations. Also, Vilnius was also a center of some Polish institution. Polish culture is also interesting city, as Lithuanians, Belarusians, and Polish claims Vilnius to be important for them. So this is maybe why this happened. I think on the eastern Belarus, especially after First World War, there were less Poles. It should happen by historical and social reasons, and I don't know exactly why, but I think it's connected especially to history after the First World War, and that Polish people have been living on the Western Belarus in the Second Polish Republic, and after the Soviet Union it was maybe harder to develop Polishness. Of course, some Polish minority was in Minsk, and this area, as I said, in Vitebsk, and then some Eastern Belarusian cities and areas there is Polish minority, but this is very small, below 7 people, so it's not much. By claiming it seems to be Polish, so maybe
Paula had some idea.
Question, actually, comment, because there was a very interesting study conducted by Anna Engelking, who studied Polishness of people living in the Grodna region, and she actually came up with this category of church Poles. So people who identify themselves as Poles, because they go to the church on Sunday and they speak Polish there, but otherwise they don't use the language really at home. So I'm just worried.
Yeah, it is still true, because even now most of Polish families, even if they claim Polish, they speak Belarusian.
So what is their sort of point of of reference when it comes to Polish?
They feel Polish because of feeling of Polishness, and Belarus is very specific, and it's even different than feeling Polishness in Poland, and sometimes even people in Poland may not understand this type of Polishness from former Eastern borderlands, that is called in Poland, but they claim Polish, they claim they feel maybe proud to be Polish, has Polish ancestry, and some connection with Polish traditions.
The Catholic Church
also is and the stereotype in Belarus of that Polish people go to church, to Catholic Church, and Belarusian people go to Orthodox Church, still existing, but actually we can observe the development of also Belarusian Catholic Church. More and more masses you can find in Belarusian language also.
Thank you.
Oh, you wanted to add
Can I
something?
also add something? Yeah, it also seems to me, and maybe that was also a comment, or I thought I had in your presentation, that it's very hard, and again, if our definition of what a Pole is comes from, let's say, the Third Polish Republic, and these are very changing ideas, there was a certain sense of what you're talking about, like the Kresy Wschodnie, the sort of, I don't know, even borderlands, I don't know how it's usually translated into English, but if we're considering what I think is actually perhaps has a little bit, I don't know, like a potential to explain and answer your question, but perhaps not, is what was actually going on, not necessarily in the early 20th century, not even after World War I, but what was happening with the Polish national movement that was much more active, much earlier than the Belarusian movement during times of the partitions of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, and in particular, a lot of this kind of narrative, a very colonial, I would say, narrative of sort of like Polish nationalism, or sort of like, I don't know, Polszczyzna as such, and if you know any fact about Poland, and the Polish national poem begins with Lithuania, but this kind of like krasowość, or this kind of like borderlandness, specifically like being here-ness, mean, I don't know. Some of my friends call this kres as well, like my friend from Szczecin, but I don't know if that's actually true.
We have a similar distribution of Polish minority with Los.
But the point here is like if you have all these like you have like Mohort, or you have like Ogniem i Mieczem, and you have like, for example, because I was thinking of Grodno, like what about Grodno in particular? Well, in Grodno, for example, we have like Eliza. I don't know how much Orzeszkowa, for example, lived there, but at the very least, what Wikipedia does tell me is that she did die there. So perhaps, people that are very much carriers and, let's say, vectors of Polish culture, but very much living in this area. And so it's like, Wilno is important, and Brześć and Grodno are important. Maybe Brześć just less so. I don't know why that was the case. Were there any famous people in the 19th century in Brześć? Maybe not in Brest. But that's my sort of comment on take on that.
Okay. All right, you had a second very brief question, and then we have Peter, and then you.
Yeah, thank
and then you.
Peter, not pizza.
Okay, to Anne as well. You mentioned something about Vyacheslav Kievich, right? The first Belarusian prime minister, last chairman of the Council of Ministers of the Belarusian Soviet Republic. Like he was patronizing Polish community, somewhat patronizing the Polish community, like allowing them to establish their cultural institutions, their schools. Because the thing is, he's highly popular considered by Belarusian people as the pro-Russian, pro-Soviet person. But I recently came across his memoirs, and there was a picture of his one of his IDs, and like his real name is not Vyacheslav, it's Czesław, which is exclusively Polish. Vyacheslav is pro-Russian, more Russian, but Czesław is exclusively Polish. He's also Catholic, like he admitted that in a couple of interviews. His last patronymic name is Franz, his father name is Franz, so he's basically Polish, right? He's a communist but Polish. Are there any other like evidences that he was somewhat involved in the Polish community back in the early 90s because of his origin, let's say?
I don't know, but in Polish revival was some case, but Polish people who were working on have great jobs or even governmental places, managerial positions, were not involved in Polish revival because they were simply afraid of losing their positions because they were afraid that but involving in Polish movement will make that Soviet or Soviet government will simply repress them for this, and this is also a difficulty by restoring Polish educational institutions and cultural institutions because, as I said, well-educated Poles and Poles with great social position were not involved in that and were not helpful. Some of them because of fear, some of them because of some kind of losing the feeling of Polishness.
Okay, thank you. Then Peter, your question?
Yeah, so I just want to preface this with if someone has already asked this question or one of the other panel presenters may have spoken on this, I've sort of been in and out of the room, so I apologize if I'm asking a question that's already been covered. But my question is to Anna, please. And when you began your presentation, you had a statistic about how many registered Poles were within Poland, but you also said that the numbers were probably inaccurate, and it could be more or much more than that. My question is, what reason today would a Pole living in Belarus want to perhaps not register as a Pole, or what are the reasons today for that number being? I mean, that number being fuzzy. Why isn't it more accurate? Are people hiding it, or is it just that people don't care, or is it? I just want to know why.
It's not because of people, it's about state propaganda to lower the number of national minority. It was in the Soviet time and is actually also in Belarus. People may notice them during they are Polish, but official governance statistics will be different. This is why this problem is to estimate the real number of Polish minority exists.
Sorry, I didn't hear you. You said it was propaganda?
Yes, it's not that Polish people hide themselves now, but it's state propaganda to lower the number of Polish people or people of other minorities.
And okay.
All right. Okay.
Okay.
All right, interesting. All right, then please, your question.
First of all, thank you all very much for 3 fascinating presentations. I've got a question for Paula. And I wondered whether it's possible, maybe it's not, but is it possible to sort of go beyond the specific sort of modern case you gave of Kura Party to delineate sort of more generally areas in which one might see sort of spontaneous Talaka today? I mean, are there areas of sort of environmental concern or sort of housing issues or provisions of social services?
Yes, actually, when I was doing my fieldwork for my PhD last year, I've been to a village in the West region. Actually, this is what people, members of this Pentecostal church, this is what they do. They do Talaka. They don't call it Talaka, but this is what they do. So they've got even something very unfortunate will happen to one of the neighbors. They would just go help. That is usually a very spontaneous act of help and assistance. They also got even a special fund, so they decided to use this money to help someone. So I think this is another very example of Talaka. As I said, I think they wouldn't call it Talaka. They would just Dopomoga.
All right, that's it. Okay, then you. Okay, well, we don't have much time. Then perhaps I want to collect 2 questions. So you and your question.
First of all, thank you for all speakers for very interesting presentations. And my question is to Anna. Maybe you know if there is any discrimination against the Belarusian majority and Belarusian culture when Western Belarus was part of Polish state in 1920 process until 1939.
Of course, it was a discrimination of Belarusian people living in Western Poland before Second World War. It happened maybe because of Poland was also restored after Russian forces fighting also with Polish language. Poles reacted maybe too much, and there was a discrimination, but in reality, and also in the before Second World War in Poland, they were two main political Polish fractions of Roman Dmowski and Józef Piłsudski, and Dmowski was more national activities, and Piłsudski promised more possibilities for national minorities, because in the eastern part of Polish Second Republic there are so much nationalities, not only Poles, not only Belarusians, but also Ukrainians, Lithuanians, Russians, Jews, Tatars, and other ones. And this is why Belarusians supported Piłsudski, but they were felt in reality also disappointed, because it was can be many examples of discrimination.
So maybe 2 questions. First you, and then you. Please.
Thank you for the presentations. My question is really rather off the wall. I wanted to ask about Belarusians in Poland, if you have any information. I had reason to know a few years ago when I visited Belarus that there is a Belarusian consulate in Białystok. So that suggests to me that there is a Belarusian community, at least in that area of Poland. Would you like to say something about Belarusians in Poland?
And maybe you also.
Yeah, I have a short question/comment for Paula. First, about the Subbotnik is considered, for example, at the United Nations as forced labor, just like modern slavery. So maybe it's worth adding like mandatory work, in fact, is forced labor. But about Talaka, I was very interested to hear about all this background and historical. I was not aware of it, and I came across Talaka as this now famous platform for fundraising.
Yeah.
And crowdfunding, and how would you see this? And of course, I understand there's a link, but is it something you also study as a form of mobilization and autonomization, and perhaps the next step of this mutual assistance work that is more and more independent from the state, actually?
Okay, let's start with Anna.
Yes, in the eastern part of Poland, especially in Białystok, as you mentioned, and also a border area, I think, next to Belarusian border, there is quite also place of or living minority of Belarus in Poland, and actually they have by law possibility to also open their Belarusian education institutions or schools with Belarusian language of instruction, but actually there is no school with Belarusian language of instructions. Only in some schools that are well known among Belarusian society, they can teach young people Belarusian language from kindergarten to up to higher education. Why there is no schools with Belarusian language of instructions? Probably Belarusians did not intend to open them, but they have quite broad possibility to learn Belarusians. Also, there is a competition for teenagers from high school of Belarusian, great Belarusian language test. If they will pass it in the great result, they have an open way to study Belarusian language at Warsaw University.
David, you had something to add on that?
Yeah, just if I can, sorry, because it's just about the same point, and yeah, but unfortunately, as far as I understand, all those resources that actually in the Polish People's Republic were opened up to study Belarusian, at the very least, a lot of times, and it's also in internal Polish politics with Silesian language and things like that. We also have problems, but as far as I know, there have been faculties as such that have already been closed down, and Warsaw is kind of like the last frontier.
It was the desktop also.
Exactly. And small point about consulates, because you mentioned it, there was actually a little bit, there used to be this kind of official Belarusian supported center in Białystok. As far as I understand now, the center is in Warsaw, and in Warsaw, and what they do, they sort of have, for example, like free Belarusian language, sorry, it's not in quotes, they are free Belarusian classes in the center of Warsaw that are taught by Wojciech Traciak, who's also at Katedra Rutynistyki at the Faculty of Belarusian Philology at the University of Warsaw. They also, for example, just opened a very big, the ambassador even was there, exhibit to do with the history of futurism. Malevich, it wasn't that good of an exhibit, sorry. But and the small point is there's also just kind of like what I was talking about in terms of sort of like these kinds of two main narratives. There's that narrative where it's obviously the embassy paying for it. It's obviously, you know, very red and green in terms of it, their advertisements, things like that. There's also the Belaruski Dom. Did you mention that? I'm sorry, I might have faded. The Belaruski Dom in Warszawie, the Belarusian house in Warsaw, which is kind of like there's a lot of institutions for, especially considering the amounts of Ukrainians and Belarusians in Poland and Warsaw in particular. It's kind of, I mean, for example, Dzień Woli, Independence. I don't know if that's the right term. Independence Day, the celebration that happened just 6 days ago on Saturday, that was orchestrated mostly by the Belarusian house, and we had a przyjęcie, we had our like little like drinks and stuff afterwards there. So this does exist as a kind of second alternative. As far as other alternatives, I would say most Belarusians aren't really that interested in speaking Belarusian, at least in my experience in Poland. A lot of them either just continue with their Russian, sort of like run in the general Russian-speaking circles, or the kind of anti-Russian Belarusian-speaking circles, or just start speaking Polish because the promise of Poland, its educational opportunities, is very enticing for a lot of Belarusians, especially those that do have, because of what you're talking about, Karta Polaka, they have their right, because of their grandparents and because of the history of the Second Polish Republic, they have a right to have free health insurance and free education in Poland, etc., etc. Sorry for going on.
Can I just very quickly
Yeah.
what you said? So this Belarusian department at the University of Białystok was closed down because there were just not enough.
That's what I'm saying.
Just to say one thing.
That's why it's holding on by the last, because you have to have people that are interested. And there's no people that are interested.
Exactly.
It's like, well,
and when it comes to speaking Belarusian language, actually, when you go to Białystok, when you go to Podlasie, actually, you will find like the whole village is speaking kind of Belarusian language with some probably Ukrainian flavor, what I call, or Polish flavor.
Local dialect.
Well, and a lot. This is what it was 100 years ago. They were just the people who were from here.
Yes, but actually they would identify themselves very often as they are definitely not Polish. Well, it doesn't mean that actually they're Tutejši, but they would actually identify them all with something which is closer to Belarusianness. And there's also a secondary school in Hajnówka, which actually...
Where's that?
Hajnówka, which offers education in Belarusian language. So actually those young people who think that actually, I want to study Belarusian of Belarus...
But that's probably, it's probably not that many people.
Well, the school is, still, continues to exist, so I think there must be some interest in it.
We have to maybe shortly mention that there are still in Belarus problems with Belarusian language because the majority of of people speaks Russian. And this is
I mean, one of the reasons I wanted to go to Warsaw and tried many ways to have an opportunity to go to Warsaw is because I was like, I'm interested in speaking better Belarusian and studying these things, and I'm certainly not going to do it for now in Minsk. So it was just sort of like Warsaw actually is the logical choice. So exactly what you're saying. Warsaw is the kind of...
Let's move to Talaka, maybe.
Yes. Thank you very much for your comment and for the question. So that's actually quite interesting to whether I should definitely think whether I should sort of engage with Talaka as an online platform and actually include it into this sort of modern versions of Talaka. Of Talaka today. The other thing is that when I approach Talaka as a sort of kind of an example of social capital, so I need to also study norms, values, and kind of relationships. So while relationships probably, I'm not sure whether Talaka platform creates kind of a network of people. If that is the case, that definitely should be something interesting, because then they must have some rules and norms and values, I believe.
Well, it's an online community service.
So, yes, definitely.
But as an example, it's the ones
very interesting.
Who managed to get funding for organizing the concert last week on the 25th of March in a matter of just a couple of weeks.
And use this crowd.
The authorization to hold the concert altogether just a couple of weeks before 25th of March 2018 for the 100th anniversary of the and it's thanks to Talaka and to a number of individuals who are very young and who, it's interesting, are obviously looking, chose the name of the platform bearing in mind this cultural background.
Do you maybe have any opinions or sources of opinions what people themselves think about Talaka and Subbotnik? Do they liked it, or did they liked it or not?
What I've read on the internet and some research on Subbotnik, well, actually I can read even forums of some online newspapers. People are very unhappy about it, and they say this is something that they have to do.
They are forced.
Okay, you speak up because I'm not sure. We can hear you. Okay. We have 10 minutes.
Just a small addendum. I'm sorry, I don't know your name, but it's a really interesting comment that you brought it up, and I'm just kind of forgetting that, that's what it was called, that crowdfunding platform that everyone uses. That it's not just a sort of white, red, white flag people that use Talaka, but it's also lots of very different kinds of people and lots of very different communities in contemporary Belarus that use it. So, for example, an initiative that was hosted by Makeout, sort of an organization that brings a lot of sort of feminists and LGBT activists and other people that are sympathetic to the cause together. They, for example, funded their first journal on gender and sexuality that came out last year. I actually contributed to this campaign, and I was like, why does this name sound so familiar? Oh yeah, Talaka.by, and it's just sort of whatever. So just to kind of put that out there, that it's actually much more broader than just two Belaruses. Everyone kind of uses it, and it's kind of great because it makes things possible.
Okay.
When other things aren't possible to get funds or register things, perhaps.
So Talaka is moving online. Good to know. All right. Any other questions from the audience? Yes, we have one. Anyone else? Okay, you. All right, please.
Introduce people into information as well.
What? Okay. Okay, then we start with you and then you.
Thank you. Untitled Chapter from Paris. I will have a quick comment for Talaka question. It's a very interesting observation that originally Talaka means a kind of this mandatory labor for serfs, a kind of this serfdom rent in the modern time. So it was something peasants should do, were obliged to do together on the forced by their lord. But then, after serfdom disappeared, the tradition of doing something still stayed, and it borrowed this old name. I think Talaka in the 17th century wasn't so nice for peasants, as it became this self-organization in the 19th century. And on the contrary, Subbotnik started as something totally more or less volunteer work, and became kind of this serfdom. So it's quite how these two terms go in opposite directions in their evolution. And maybe it's also will contribute to understanding of these terms.
Cool. Interesting. Thank you.
And to contribute a bit to this discussion about criteria of Polishness and so on used, I would like to ask if there are any definitions of what is Polishness used by these Polish organizations, like Union of Poles in Belarus or these schools. Did they have any definition of whom to consider a Pole, who can who is a target of their care, and or is it just a very wide idea of everyone who can come and without even considering himself Pole, just join to these activities? Is there any legal or more or less formulated public definitions of this term considering Belarus?
Okay, thank you for that. We'll start with Paula, perhaps, if she wants to add anything.
No, actually, thank you very much for, yes, that's a very interesting point.
Good, thank you. Then Anna.
Polish Union to Belarus, I don't think there is some, estimated definition of Polishness. Of course, a man needs to identify himself as a Pole, has some knowledge about Poland, Polishness, some feeling that he's connected with Polish culture, also has some cultivate some maybe Polish values, Polish culture, and be eager to, be active in this Polish movement. But there is no exact, I think, definitions. We have still some of people who claim themselves to be Polish, but they, for example, do not speak Polish at all or very less, and many children which are going to the first class of school with Polish language of the instruction also do not know. They do not know Polish language at all. They are learning from basis. So there is not particular definitions. And from another side, according to because we have an institution of Polish card, as David mentioned, it's a document. It's given from 2007. It was constructed by Polish government and is dedicated to people from post-Soviet, Polish people from post-Soviet countries, and some kind of confirmations of their Polish identity. And with this card, they come to Poland. They have some benefits. Are, for example, cheaper tickets for buses, for trains. They also can study for free with not paying in university, because foreigners must all pay for studying at Polish universities. And this is also a point of interest. And if you want to get this Polish card, you have to pass a test from the language.
It's not that serious. One of my friends was just like, tak, nie, tak, nie, tak, nie. That's the test.
In general, but it's also, and you have to confirm you have a Polish ancestry. But as I know, there are some companies in Belarus who are specializing in finding your Polish ancestry, even if you don't have Polish ancestry, because people simply just want to have Polish card to have these benefits while going to Poland. So it's also very
because of their raging pride for Mickiewicz and because they've read the literature.
All right. Thank you.
Yes, Peter Devins. Just a question for Paula. Can you compare Talaka, the rules mutual aid movement in Belarus with other countries, let's say Ukraine or Russia of that time, or Poland?
I haven't compared, but I am aware that actually it was also popular on Polish lands, the same with Russian lands and Ukrainian. And you can find like tłoka, that would be the case, how we would call it in Polish language, how we would call it talaka. So, but I haven't, but actually that might be interesting to bring it into the context.
So it goes to your question about the manifestations of Talaka in contemporary Belarusian society. I was listening to Russian radio about a month ago. They're talking about this issue of strengthening the union. And this Russian commentator said that Belarusians and Russian societies are not compatible because Belarusians sort their trash. And this may be one of the legacies of Talaka, that people realize, okay, I'm part of a community, and the community requires me to sort my trash.
Oh, wow. Sounds like we have a long tradition of trash sorting and another contribution to ecology. All right.
Just a quick comment, putting on my legal hat. Actually, these Subbotniks are illegal as a matter of international labor law.
Oh, right.
Because
Yes.
people are supposed to work, and if they're not paid for this work, and if they don't work, then they face some sort of punishment.
Yeah.
And the International Labour Organization made on a number of occasions this observation that this is illegal. And so unless people do it voluntarily without the fear of being punished, then this is talaka, then you can say this is pure community work, but otherwise it's forced labor which is prohibited by international law.
Yeah, right. That's what actually the comment of Dr. Marin was making in relation to UN legislation, as I understood. All right. Do we have any more questions, or we can conclude? Yeah, seems like we can conclude and proceed to the, I understand, coffee break, right? Coffee break, which lasts until 12. And after 12, we have a new panel in the same room, in the very same room here. Thank you, panel. Yeah, thank you, panel, and thank you for your questions.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Czy to naprawdę było tak ciężko zrozumieć? Bo to tak dziwne, że oni za pytanie rysują.